The Echo of My Shout by VMS. There are cries that shatter glass, and there are cries that shatter the shelf. Mira's first scream did not tear through air, it folded inward. It dissolved into the architecture of expectation, into the disciplined silence of a household where achievement replaced affection and endurance masqueraded as a virtue. Here we could hear the cry of Mira, which was not heard by anyone. I could say that the first time Mira screamed, no one heard her. The house had observed the sound, the walls painted in patient pastels swallowed it whole. The ceiling fan continued its indifferent rotation. Her mother's bangles clinked in the kitchen. Her father's newspaper rustled like a verdict already written, and the child's small, watchful, prematurely wise learned the most dangerous lesson of a life. Silence is safer than sound. But sounds does not die, it reverberates, it waits. Years later, as Dr. Mira Iyer, a psychologist of formidable intellect and measured composure, she would sit across from fractured souls and tell them gently, your voice deserves a space. She would say it with authority, she would say it with compassion, and yet inside her ribcage lived a trapped cry, still circling the corridors of memory like a restless ghost. This is the story of that echo and of the man who heard it. Mira's first scream did not tear the air through. It folded inward, dissolved into the architecture expectation, into the disciplined silence of a household where achievement replaced affection and endurance masqueraded as virtue. She learned early that sound unsettles order, so she mastered quiet. She excelled, she ascended, she became Dr. Mira Ayo, a psychologist, a scholar, healer of fractured minds. She built a profession upon listening to the tremors in other people's lives and stories, and she interpreted the trauma with a scholarly precision, and she spoke about resilience with measured authority. But within her own consciousness, an echo persisted. It was not loud enough to be heard by others, yet it was relentless. It reverberated through police stations that mocked her courage, through courtrooms that dissected her dignity, through boardrooms that applauded her intellect, with negotiating her boundaries and adjustments, and it followed her through family betrayals and professional sabotage. It haunted her sleep with forests of pursuit and corridors without doors. The echo was not merely memory, it was accumulation. Until one day she encountered a man who did not attempt to silence it. Rajiv, a cardiologist, survivor of his own emotional dissolution, did not offer rescue, he offered presence. He did not interrogate her past for curiosity, he received it so that it might finally rest. And in the quiet alchemy of being heard, the echo began to change. And this is not a story of victimhood, it is a story of reclamation, of how women who shouted into indifferences transformed that reverberation into voice, of how she wounded, two wounded histories converged into to relieve pain, but to rewrite its consequences, and of how love when conscious does not erase scars and it dignifies them. And the first chapter, the sound becomes voice. Years later, at a public lecture on trauma and resilience, Dr. Mirai stood before an audience. I was once a child who believed silence was survival, she began. But silence, when prolonged, becomes a prison. The work of healing is not to erase the past, but to reinterpret it, to take the echo of our pain and refine it into our voice. In the audience, Rajiv listened not as a savior, not as a guardian, but as equal. When the applause faded and the hall emptied, she felt no panic, no trapped cry, only a steady interior quiet. The child had not disappeared, she had grown, and the echo that once haunted her had become a resonance, strong, lucid, unashamed. For when a shout is finally heard, it ceases to be an echo, it becomes a truth. And it is a flashback, the airport's applause and architecture of a second life. The applause in Singapore was still reverberating when Meera felt it, that subtle internal shift from the present to memory. She stood beside Rajiv beneath the glass geometry of Marina Bay Sands Convention Center, cameras flashing, delegates clustering around them for photographs. Behind them, the skyline glittered, steel and water and tropical dusk woven into modern precision. The banner overhead read, "The Echo Foundation Global Conclave on Second Chances and Trauma Integration." Yet, as she smiled for yet another photograph, her mind traveled backward, not to despair, to distance, because this life, this confident international presence, this synchronized partnership had once been inconceivable. And Singapore, the beginning of global resonance, and their first international summit had unfolded in Singapore, a city that seemed engineered for reinvention, clean lines, relentless efficiency, a skyline that appeared to have negotiated elegantly with gravity. They walked along gardens of the bay the evening before the conference, the super trees illuminated like bioluminescence, guardians of modern aspiration. Rajiv filmed a short message for their foundation's online community, while Meera captured panoramic views of the fountains and the foundation archive. And architecture, Rajiv remarked, gazing upward, is what resilience looks like when translated into steel. Meera smiled, then perhaps trauma recovery in architecture is the architecture of the psyche. And the conference itself drew psychologists from Southeast Asia, diaspora communities from Malaysia, Indian origin professionals, and survivors who had read her book in translation. Questions were incisive, cultural nuances surface, family honor, silence around divorce, the stigma of late life companionship. Mira spoke with clarity, dissecting shame as inherited narrative, and Rajiv addressed somatic stress responses with a clinical eloquence. In the evenings, they allowed themselves pleasure at a hardcore center in Chinatown. They sample Hainanese chicken rice and laksa fragrant with the coconut and lemongrass, and delicate kaya toast layered with pandan sweetness. And Rajiv, usually measured in appetites, surrendered to chili crab and laughing as sauce strained his fingers. And second chances, he declared, between bites, should taste this unapologetically. And they walked along the Singapore River, the skyline mirrored in dark water, and for a fleeting moment, Mira felt an almost surreal gratitude. Once she had run from institutions, now she was invited by the same. And Kuala Lumpur and Penang, conversations in humidity and heritage. Malaysia welcomed them with humid generosity. In Kuala Lumpur, beneath the vertiginous symmetry of the Petronas Towers, they held a symposium addressing cross-cultural trauma among migrant families. Women approached Mira quietly afterward, and engineers, homemakers, executives speaking in hushed tones about emotional abandonment masked by financial security. Raju facilitated a parallel session on midlife cardiovascular risk among expatriates professionals, his voice resonant, authoritative, yet compassionate. They traveled to Penang between engagements, walking through Georgetown's colonial streets and past murals and Peranakan houses painted in improbable blues and greens. Meera recorded short reflective videos against temple backdrops speaking about heritage and healing. Food became memory, and nasi lemak wrapped in banana leaf and chartaway teo sizzling in straight works. Teh tarlik pulled theoretically into froth. And cultural memory is stored in cuisine. Mira mused as they sat overlooking the Strait of Malacca. And trauma, Rajiv added softly, is often stored in silence, and they were no longer tentative in public spaces. They walked side by side, not flaunting intimacy, not discussing it, and simply inhabiting it. Dubai glass, gold, and gravitas. And Dubai received them with opulence, and their conference took place in a hotel ballroom overlooking the Burj Khalifa, a vertical assertion against a desert horizon. The audience included corporate leaders, medical specialists, and South Asian expatriates navigating fractured marriages abroad. Here, the conversations were sharper and what of reputation? One participant asked, what of family honor? Meera answered with composure, honor that demands silence and control, dignity that permits articulation in liberation. And Rajiv addressed a men's panel separately, speaking about emotional neglect, about masculine stoicism, and the calcifies into isolation. Between sessions, they ascended the Burj Khalifa. From that height, the desert resembled an abstract painting, beige infinities interrupted by geometric ambition. The denied of a messy, hummus velvety as silk, and tableau bright with parsley, saffron infused rice beneath a tender lamp, dates glistened like a polished amber, all eaten by Raji. But Meera, as she is a pure vegetarian, she just ate a sandwich, veg sandwich. In the desert that evening, seated beneath a sky stripped of urban interruption, Meera felt a quiet astonishment. Once she whispered, I believed my world was shrinking. Rajiv glanced at the horizon. Now it expands. Toronto and Canada, snow and stillness. Toronto greeted them with winter snow lined the pavements outside the convention hall near Lake Ontario. The audience included South Asian immigrants, second generation professionals, and the elderly couples navigating loneliness after children relocated across provinces, those who felt that emptiness syndrome. And Meera's keynote focused on emptiness syndrome and identity reconstruction. Rajiv presented data correlating prolonged loneliness with cardiovascular morbidity in aging populations. Afterward, they visited the CN Tower looking down at a city softened by frost. Meera laughed nervously while standing on the glass floor. Rajiv recorded her mock indignation. They traveled briefly to Niagara Falls, water thundering in relentless descent, and missed risking like breath in cold air. And it's violent, Mira observed, watching the cascade, and yet Rajiv replied, it is magnificent. They tasted maple syrup fresh from a rural farm, warm, poutine layered with curds and gravy, and salmon grilled with subtle northern restraint. The cold sharpened their closeness, and they walked arm in arm, and not for display but for warmth. Australia, the sunlight and spaciousness. Sydney unfolded in luminous blue. The conference hall overlooked the harbour. The Opera House curved like sails ready for departure. Here, discussions centered on second marriages among professionals and the emotional recalibration required when adult children resist parental companionship. Meera facilitated a workshop on trust after betrayal, and Rajiv led a session on integrated wellness models. They claimed the Sydney Harbour Bridge at dawn harnessed yet exhilarated the wind tucked at her scarf. Rajiv's laughter carried unrestrained. In Melbourne, they wandered through Lamb's Lane, dense with the street art, and sipping flat whites crafted with almost ceremonial precision. They tasted pavlova, light as cloud, and lamingtons dusted with coconut. And there was ease between them now, an absence of hypervigilance, and she did not scan rooms for threat, and he did not brace for scrutiny. And the Europe history and healing Europe felt contemplative in London beneath the neoclassical gravitas of academic halls. They discussed institutional reform and trauma-informed policy. In Paris, Mira spoke about narrative reclamation while seated in a hall overlooking the Seine. In Rome, Rajiv lectured within sight of ancient stone, reminding audiences that civilizations survive fracture through adaptation. They walked through the Louvre hand in hand, passing between painting before paintings of sufferings and transmuted into art in Switzerland after a mental health summit in Geneva, and they sat beside Lake Geneva, Alpine air crisp and unsentimental. In Florence, over plates of handmade pasta and olive oil that tasted of sunlit grooves, and Rajiv remarked, Renaissance followed plague. Meera responded softly, rebirth follows devastations. They captured photographs everywhere, not posed excessively but authentic, laughter in a Viennese cafe and contemplative silhouettes against the Eiffel Tower at dusk, and wind tousled hair on the cliffs of the Santorini and reflective quiet along the canals of Amsterdam. And these were not merely travel images, and they were documentation of survival refined into celebration. The flashback returns to the present back in Singapore. Applause subsided, delegates continued requesting selfies, copies of a book, collaborative partnerships. Rajiv coordinated effortlessly, ensuring schedule, protecting her energy, answering inquiries with a diplomatic fairness. As twilight descended over Marina Bay, Mira felt the full arc of it, from corridors of intimidation to corridors of international discourse, from silence complaint to structured global advocacy, from solitary endurance to synchronized companionship. And they were not flawless. They still navigated fatigue, logistical complexities, cultural resistance, but they did so as architects of their own second life. Later that evening, walking along the Helix Bridge, illuminated in violet light, Mira turned to Rajiv. Do you ever feel, she asked softly, that we are living what once felt forbidden? He regarded the skyline thoughtfully. No, he replied, we are living what once felt improbable. She smiled. Their second chance was not flamboyant recklessness, it was deliberate magnificence. And as the city light shimmered across the water, Meera realized that the echo, which once tormented her, had evolved into something else entirely, a resonance strong enough to travel continents, a partnership steady enough to withstand altitudes, and a life no longer defended but fully and unapologetically lived. A child who learned to disappear. Mira's childhood was not violent in ways that leave bruises, and it was far more meticulous than that. Her father believed in discipline the way monarchs believe in divine right, and he was not cruel, he was correct. Correction was his love language, and marks below perfection were moral failures, and tears were theatrical excess, and affection was indulgence. Her mother, a woman of fine silences, perfected the art of accommodation. She smoothed arguments with submission, diluted fury with compliance, and in doing so, taught her daughter an ancestral script with submission survived by shrinking. Mira learned to read moods before alphabets. She could anticipate a tempo from the angle of a teacup, and she could measure danger from the cadence of footsteps. And childhood became a laboratory of vigilance. At night, she dreamt of corridors without doors, of calling out and hearing her own voice written distorted. In those dreams, she was always searching for someone who would answer, but mornings always arrived with mathematics medals and merit list, and achievement became her armor, excellence her invisibility clock. No one noticed that she had stopped laughing freely. Chapter 2, The Woman Who Had Healed Others. Dr. Meera Iyer was now for a calm. A patient described as anchoring, lucid, unflinching. Her office was curated in shades of quiet, soft beige walls, diffused amber light, and faint scent of sandalwood. She specialized in trauma. She listened to narratives of violation, betrayal, abandonment. She held stories that trembled in her presence. She understood dissociation not as a pathology but as a poetry of survival, and yet sometimes mid sessions when a client spoke of father's coldness or a childhood of conditional love, Mira felt that her throat tightened, her pen would pass for a fraction of a second, the professional dissolved into the child. She knew that the terminology, complex trauma, attachment wounds, hypervigilance, internalized shame, and she could cite research, design interventions, guide cognitive restructuring. What she could not do was apply her expertise to herself. Her own past remained a sealed archive and catalogued but unopened. And the anatomy of violation, if childhood had trained Mira in discipline of silence, workplace perfected its orchestration. Dr. Mira entered a profession with luminous credentials and an incorruptible ethic. She believed knowledge was sanctified by service. She believed institutions existed to protect both the healer and the healed. And she was wrong. Her brilliance was first noticed, then praised, then appropriated. And a senior consultant lauded publicly as a pioneer in trauma studies began to cite her research in conferences without attribution. He introduced her as my prodigy, a term that sounded generous but functioned as annexation. In meetings, he would say Mira has a rare sensitivity and allow the sentence to linger just long enough to suggest that sensitivity required guidance, and his guidance the compliments came lackward with a uh, condes- condescension, and you are extraordinary, another superior told her once, fingers resting too long on the back of a chair. But you must learn how the system works. Adjustment as wisdom. Adjustment, the word written like a familial ghost. And adjustment meant accepting longer hours without formal acknowledgement. It meant observing caseloads transferred quietly into her schedule while male colleagues preserved a reputational leisure. It meant smiling through insinuations that a success was charm assisted. It meant declining invitations to private dinners where mentorship was promised and boundaries were expected to dissolve. When she refused politely, precisely the atmosphere altered, appreciation hardened into surveillance. Her reports were scrutinized, her treatment plans questioned, rumors began to circulate, whispered insinuations about her temperament, about her difficulty, her alleged ingratitude. And one evening, as she rejected a senior administrator's suggestion that she accompany him to an out of town conference for strategic networking, her annual evaluation shifted abruptly from exemplary to inconsistent. It was then she understood exploitation often masquerades an opportunity, and there were subtle violations too. The aestheticized consumption of her presence at corporate gatherings. She became spectacle rather than a scholar. Eyes assessed her not for insight but for possession. Invitations were coded with expectations, and offers of funding came tethered to proximity. And you must compromise if you want to rule the roost. One colleague advised, his tone paternal and his meaning unmistakable. And Mira felt the old reflex stir the child trained to comply, but the woman did not bow. She began documenting everything. Emails were reviewed meticulously and conversations summarized and time stamped. And she consulted legal counsel not impulsively but strategically. And what others assumed was emotional fragility was, in fact, forensic patience. And when she filed a formal complaint citing intellectual theft, harassment, and professional sabotage, humiliation, and physical mental torture, that institution attempted to dissuade her. Think of your career, madam. They won't. She replied, and the inquiry was exhaustive, humiliating in its intimacy. Her integrity was dissected alongside the misconduct, and she was advised to settle quietly as she refused. And months later, findings were issued. Some kind of sanctions imposed, public acknowledgement mandated. It was not poetic justice, and institutions rarely deliver poetry, but it was accountability. For the first time, Mira experienced a confrontation without collapse. Her siblings and had long regarded her success with a peculiar ambivalence, a blend of pride and resentment that fermented slowly into hostility after their parents' passing, and property became the axis of contention. Her brother, now earlier being helpful, now volatile, had cultivated a reputation in local circles for influence edged with intimidation. He possessed the theoreticality of righteousness and the cunning of calculation. Documents were produced bearing signature. She did not recall giving financial transaction surface and that redirected inheritance under the pretext of family management. When she questioned him, his response was venomous and you will never hear his pat and you chase prestige. And while we carry responsibility had apparently included transferring assets into his name. Legal notices followed. Allegations manufactured. Her attempts at meditation were dismissed as illegal. Notices followed, and arrogance. And her brother's associates visited her home with veiled threats disguised as a negotiation. Her elder sister, institutionalized in psychiatric asylum, remained unreachable, lost to the labyrinth of schizophrenia. Her voice fractured beyond coherence, and the next sister second sister, divorced and embittered, maintained a watchful distance and narcissus, her sympathy conspicuously absent. There was in her case a quiet anticipation as though Mira's unraveling would validate her own grievances, and blood Mira learned does not guarantee benevolence. The litigation was protracted and corrosive, and assets were frozen, and accounts scrutinized. Her professional adversaries watched with thinly concealed satisfaction as personal turmoil seeped into public perception. Ultimately, though portions of property were legally restored, the emotional inheritance was irrevocably fractured. Trust lay in ruins, more dissolute than financial loss. She relocated, and the migration she believed would grant her anonymity and reinvention distance from the entanglements of blood and bureaucracy. Instead, she discovered the geography does not utilize predation. Inner cities, new institutions, admiration once again trailed expectation. Landlords extended leases with insinuation. Investors proposed partnership laced with possession. A philanthropist offered to sponsor her independent trauma center provided she remained accessible, and men circle brilliance the way moths circle flame, drawn not to warmth but to conception. And she began to recognize a pattern: vulnerability perceived as invitation, intelligence misread as a negotiable, solitude interrupted as availability. And there were nights she locked her apartment door and felt an ancient fatigue settled into her bones, the exhaustion of perpetual defense. Yet, paradoxically, within the sanctuary of her clinic, something transformative was occurring. As patients narrated their violations of body boundary, thus Mira felt an unexpected convergence. Their stories did not overwhelm her, they illuminated her. A young intern described a supervisor who praised her talent while demanding loyalty beyond contract. A middle aged woman recounted siblings who manipulated inheritance through gaslighting and forged consent. A migrant professional wept over predatory benefactors who conflated support with ownership. Listening made her recognize the architecture of her own suffering, but this time she did not dissociate. She connected each testimony and functioned as a mirror. Each session became a site of dual healing. Clients and invisibility, her wound. She began to articulate patterns not merely as theory but as lived recognition. Exploitation thrives where silence had been conditioned. Predators identified those trained to endure, and adjustment is often a euphemism for erasure. One afternoon, after a particularly harrowing session, she remained seated long after the patient left, and the office was quiet, bathed in late afternoon amber. I was violated, she said aloud, not sexually alone, though the danger had shadowed her, but intellectually, emotionally, legally, structurally, and psychologically, and I survived. The declaration did not tremble. For years, she had interpreted resilience as endurance, and now she understood resilience as reclamation. profession. The demons had not vanished, institutions remained flawed, and family fractures persisted, predators existed in every geography. But she was no longer the child whose shout dissolved into wallpaper. She was a woman who had stood upright before systems, before blood, and before desire disguised as generosity, and refused to be devoured. And in the act of listening to others who reclaim themselves, she began quietly and irrevocably to reconcile her own echo. And the next chapter, it is about the professional chaos. It began subtly, a misdiagnosis, minor but avoidable, a client's sudden relapse, an ethical complaint lodged by a colleague who envied her rising reputation, administrative scrutiny, endless meetings, the clinical world which she had navigated with a scholarly precision, turned labyrinthine, and sleep abandoned her. Nightmares returned, corridors echoes, no doors, and during sessions, her composure felt rigorous rather than natural. She experienced moments of dissociation, a subtle drifting. A halo began to fracture under the cumulative weight of the unprocessed memory. In supervision meetings, she spoke of burnt out, and she spoke of compassion fatigue, and she did not speak of the child who still trembled inside her. Then came the panic attack. It occurred not in the private but in the conference hall beneath the fluorescent lights and professional applause. Her breath shortened, her vision narrowed, her heartbeat became an erratic percussion, and she excused herself with grace, collapsed in a restroom stall, and wept not delicately but with an animal despair she had not permitted in decades. The echo had returned, louder. And the next chapter, Rajiv did not enter our life as a rescuer. He entered as a listener, and they met at a mental health symposium where he was invited as a guest speaker, a cardiologist known for his work in psychosomatic medicine. He spoke of the heart not merely as an organ but as an archive of emotion. The body, he said, keeps immaculate records when the mind negotiates denial. Mira felt something inside her stirred. Their first conversation was neither dramatic nor intimate, and it was precise, intelligent, almost formal. They discussed research, neurobiology, cross disciplinary approaches. Yet beneath the exchange followed an unarticulated familiarity, as though they were continuing a dialogue began in another lifetime. And Rajiv possessed an unusual stillness. It was not a passivity, it was presence. When he looked at her, he seemed to see beyond her curated competence. And that seemed to beyond her curated competence. You listen beautifully, he told her once. And you, she asked lightly. I listen for what is being said. The words unsettled her. And the next chapter, it is about the unraveling. Their bond deepened gradually through conversation that migrated from academic to existential. One evening over coffee, they had long gone cold. Rajiv asked quietly, "Who held you when you were who held you when you were afraid as a child?" The question, simple and surgical, ruptured her, and she laughed reflexively. And I was never afraid. And he did not challenge her. He waited. Silence, when offered with respect, becomes an invitation, and something in his waiting dismantled her defenses. I don't remember being held, she whispered. The admission felt treasonous. And Rajiv did not rush to console. He did not romanticize her suffering. He did not assume the posture of a savior. Instead, he said, "Then perhaps it is time you hold that child now." Her eyes burned. For the first time in her life, Mira narrated her own story aloud, not as a clinical case history, but as a lived ache. And she spoke of a correction mistaken for love, of praise and evaporated as an imperfection of night that was swallowed as though is the disturbed architecture of authority. And trust did not arrive to Mira as a gentle inclination, and came as a tremor. For years, she had mastered disclosure without revelation, and she could narrate events clinically, convert devastation into data, humiliation into hypothesis, but intimacy demanded something far more perilous, unedited truth. Rajiv had never pressed her. He had listened to her speak of insinuations and litigations, of betrayal and migration, of vigilance disguised as professionalism, yet he sensed the submerged shatter beneath her carefully curated narrative the shame she carried like an invisible watermark. And one evening, rain pressed against the windows of his apartment in a steady, contemplative rhythm. The city beyond seemed blurred, indistinct, and as though granting them privacy, they sat opposite one another, the space between them charged not with seduction but with solemnity. I have not told you everything, Meera began, her voice lacked in usual modulation. It was raw and armor. Rajiv did not move closer, he did not interrupt, he simply inclined his head, granting her the dignity of her own space. At every moment, she continued, when I questioned my own complicity, when superiors crossed boundaries subtly, strategically, I wondered whether I had encouraged it by being ambitious, and when I lost property to my siblings, I wondered whether success had made me arrogant, and when men looked at me as if I were an opportunity to possess, I wondered whether solitude had made me appear available. And her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. I began to believe that perhaps something in me invites violation. The confession hung between them, fragile and incendiary, and Rajiv felt a surge of protectiveness so immediate it startled him, yet he restrained the impulse to contradict quickly. Protection, he understood, must not eclipse her articulation. Shame, he said gently, is often the residue of someone else's wrongdoing. She met his gaze and eyes shimmering not with theatrical tears but with exhausted honesty. There are parts of my past, she whispered, that feel stained, moments I regret, situations I tolerate longer than I should have. I'm afraid that if you see all of it, you will see me differently. It was the most naked fear that she had ever voiced, not abandonment by insinuations, but rejection by the one man whose presence felt like a sanctuary. Rajiv rose then, not dramatically, but with a deliberate grace. He sat beside her, not encroaching, not claiming, simply near. Meera, he said, his voice was unwavering. There is nothing you can tell me that you will make me diminish, that will make me diminish you. She searched his face for pity. She found none, only steadiness. I do not need a perfected version of you, he continued. I do not need you edited, filtered, or resilient on command. I accept you as you are, wounded, wise, weary, and luminous, and you don't have to perform strength for me. The word struck something ancient within her, the child who had learned that love was conditional upon excellence. I'm afraid to trust shared method. Every time I had trusted, something has been taken, then let this different, he replied. And trust does not have to be immediate, and it was incremental. You can give me fragments and I hold them carefully. And she exhaled a sound halfway between relief and grief. And for hours she spoke, not with clinical detachment of a psychologist, but with a fractured cadence of someone revisiting rooms long still. She described moments of corrosive price, insinuation that blurred professional boundaries, a humiliating awareness of being evaluated for desirability rather than intellect. She spoke of her brother's manipulation of forged signatures and legal intimidation, of the corrosive loneliness of fighting blood in court, and she spoke of migrating with hope and encountering the same predatory gaze in unfamiliar streets. At times her voice faltered, at times anger surfaced, sharp and unsparing, and at times she felt silent, overwhelmed by the density of the memory. And Rajiv listened, not because he was curious, not because he required evidence of her suffering. In truth, part of him reconciled the images forming in his mind. He did not want her to relive them. He did not need to catalog her pain to justify his love. And if it were possible, he would have chosen ignorance of her anguish over her re exposure to it. But he understood something essential. Silence had been her prison, and if she was not to be free, she had to hear herself speak without interruption, without correction, and without moral arbitration. And he reached for her hand only when her words dissolved into trembling. You do not have to revisit every shadow, he said softly. I'm not asking you to relive it for my sake. I do not need to know every detail to stand with you. I care about your present, about the peace we can build now. She looked at him startled. You are not disturbed. I'm saddened that you endured it, he replied, but I'm not disturbed by you. There is a difference. His thumb traced a slow, reassuring arc around her knuckles. I listen so much, may empty what you have carried alone, he continued, not because I wish to inhabit those memories. Honestly, I would prefer you never had to recall them again. But if speaking them releases you, then speak. And when you are tired, we will leave the past and where it belongs. The distinction pierced her defenses more profoundly than the grand declaration could have, and he was not consuming her drama as narrative. He was not positioning himself as a savior of a tragic heroine, and he was offering containment without possession. And for the first time, she allowed herself to weep without apology. I have been strong for too long, she murmured against his shoulder. Then rest, he said simply. You do not need to be indestructible with me. They sat that way for long while the rain subsiding, and then the city resuming its indifferent rhythm. And there was no dramatic resolution, no cathartic crescendo, only a quiet recalibration. Later, when she grew composed, Rajiv spoke again. I do not want your past to become the centerpiece of our future, Meera. He said, it explains you, but it does not define you. I'm interested in the woman sitting beside me right now, the one who has survived and still chooses integrity, the one who can love, who can think, and who can build. He lifted her chin gently and kissed her temple so she would meet his eyes, and we would not construct our life around your wounds. We will acknowledge them, yes, of course, but we will cultivate joy deliberately, peace deliberately. Something within her settled trust did not transform into blind surrender. It became a measured offering, a willingness to believe the protection need to be controlling, that acceptance need not be conditional, that love need not be interrogated. Every scar. That night, as she prepared to leave, she passed through the doorway. I have never spoken like this to anyone, Rajiv, she said. You do not owe me gratitude for listening, Gamira. He replied, you owe yourself credit for speaking. And when she stepped into the night, the air felt alto, lighter, almost translucent. For the first time in years, her memories did not pursue her as a predator. They lingered at her distance, acknowledgement, but not omnipotent. And somewhere within the echo of her old shame softened no longer a scream, ricocheting in the darkness, and but a voice that had finally been received without judgment, without demand, and without fear. The next chapter, it is about the night mass and the naming, and the healing did not arrive as a revelation, and it arrived as excavation therapy. A wound therapy began. The irony was not lost to her. To sit in the client's chair required a humility more formidable than any academic accolade, and memory surfaced with a ferocious clarity. A birthday forgotten, a report got torn, and a sentence repeated so often it calcified into identity. You must not be weak. And Rajiv accompanied her not as a therapist but as a witness. The nightmares returned, but not as an abstraction but as more of a reenactments. I Sleep Meera was no longer Dr. Io composed and articulate, and she was a girl lost in the forest depths with the shadows, barefoot, breathless, pursued by faceless figures, and whose footsteps echoed louder than her own heartbeat. And trees leaned inward like silent witness. The path dissolved beneath her feet, and she called out, and the sound ricocheted back and distorted, accusatory. And she would awake with her throat dry, palms damp, and taste of metal in her mouth. And Raju would find her sitting upright in the darkness, eyes open yet elsewhere. Again, he would ask softly. She would nod. And but some nights the dream did not dissolve into waking. It lingered, demanding articulation. And one such night, unable to bear the pressure of memory, she spoke. And there was a time she began, her voice fragile but steady, when I felt like a fawn in the woods, too aware of danger, too timid to confront it fully. I thought endurance was a virtue. She described the years when she sacrificed the bloom of her youth to secure stability for her children. Years structured around tuition fees and school admission, safeguarding reputation. She negotiated humiliation so that her children might inherit dignity. She absorbed insult so that they might inherit opportunities. I believed if I swallowed enough pain, she said their lives would be spared. In the process, her own life receded into postponement, and there had been abuse, insidious, systematic dramatic, not always spectacular, but relentless. When professional predators overstep boundaries, when harassment transgressed into correction, and she did what she had taught her patients to do. She reported it. She went to the police station alone. I thought the law would be neutral. She said, a faint, incredulous smile touching her lips. I thought truth had its own authority. The officer on duty, I listened with an indulgent tilt of the head. His question began formally, then meandered into insinuations. Why were you alone with him, and what were you wearing, and do you have previous complaints? Her request to register an FIR was received as inconvenience, and papers were shuffled and tea sipped. Time elongated into intimidation. When she persisted, the atmosphere shifted. A mockery replaced civility, and she was told she was educated enough to understand the consequences. A senior officer suggested meditation rather than public scandal. When she refused compromise, her statement was diluted, language altered, gravity minimized, and then she said, her hands trembling despite years of restraint. They began to look at me not as a complainant but as an opportunity. One officer, under the guise of clarification, insisted she returned after years. Another offered protection in exchange of personal meetings. The very space meant to safeguard her became a predatory terrain. I realized, she whispered, and that I walked into a den and announced myself alone. The image from her nightmares sharpened. She ran from pillar to post, filing representations, drafting petitions, writing to higher authorities. The days dissolved into bureaucratic corridors and the smelling of dust and indifferences. Her dignity was tested not by a single violation but by cumulative erosion. And when the matter reached court, and she believed the architecture of justice would restore balance, instead she encountered performance. Defense advocates smirked openly. The public prosecutor, meant to represent the state's commitment of fairness, treated her testimony with pre-functionary impatience. Questions were not designed to elucidate truth but to fracture credibility. It is not true, one advocate had all asked loudly, that you are habituated to filing complaints against men, and the courtroom murmured. Another suggested that her professional expertise in trauma made her imaginative, and even the magistrate's gaze carried skepticism edged with weariness. Adjournments multiplied, dates extended, files misplayed. She became known not as a survivor but as the woman who complains, and money circulated in invisible channels. Muscle power hovered outside court premises. Political affiliation shielded the accused like ceremonial armor. One by one, cases concluded in the B report: insufficient evidence, lack of corroboration, and benefit of doubt. Criminals acquitted, predators reinstated, her name dragged. I began to doubt not my truth, she said, but the utility of truth. Rajiv sat across from her, unmoving except for the silent descent of tears. He did not attempt to conceal the idea of her standing alone in police stations, in courtrooms thick with hostility, ignited a grief so profound it broadened on rage. He wanted to curse the system, to confront names, to dismantle structures, but he knew that fury, however righteous, could not retroactively protect her. She continued, voice hollow with memory. They called me unstable, vindictive, attention seeker, and they said I was habituated to complaint. Each dismissal felt like another violation, not of body this time, but of narrative. She described leaving courtrooms with a spine erect despite interior collapse, and she described returning home to children who needed dinner, homework, supervision, reassurance. She described nights when she lay awake calculating legal fees against school expenses. And I wondered whether silence would have been easier, she admitted. Rajiv moved closer then, not as a secure but as a witness untent. You were braver than the institutions you approached, Meera, he said hoarsely. She shook her head faintly. Bravery is expensive. And yes, he agreed, but so in surrender. Silence expanded between them, but in time was not oppressive, it was shared. I cannot erase what happened, Meera, he said after a long while. I cannot rewrite those judgments or punish those men. I cannot retrieve that years you spent running from one authority to another. His voice trembled, not with weakness but with a helpless empathy. But I can do this, he continued. I can ensure that you never again stand alone in a room asking to be heard. I can ensure that your present and future are secure, not negotiated. I can be the place for you to return to without armor. She looked at him exhausted and luminous, and she said, Rajiv, I do not need you to fight them, she said quietly. I fought enough, then let me protect your peace, Mira, he replied. There was no theatrical voice and a theatrical vow, no promise of revenge, only a commitment of steadiness. In the nights that followed, when nightmare seized home, Rajiv would sit beside her like a vigilant sentinel. Sometimes he spoke softly, recounting mundane details of the day to anchor her to the present. Sometimes he simply held her hand until her breathing steadied. At times he became almost maternal in tenderness, cajoling her to eat when anxiety stole appetite, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before she could feel the cold, and brushing stray hands of hair from her forehead as though soothing a fevered child. And you have carried enough, he would murmur. Let the past remain documented, not relived. Mira, gradually the forest in her dreams altered. The fawn still stood there, timid, altered, alert, but no longer entirely alone. The trees seemed less predatory. A path, faint but visible, emerged. One night she woke from a dream not of pursuit but of pause. She had stood still in the forest and realized that footsteps were echoes of her own. She told Rajiv the next morning. He smiled gently. You are no longer running. She considered this. The courts had not vindicated her. The police had not protected her. The system had not redeemed itself. Money and power had indeed played with their gory roles, but she had not been annihilated. And now, in the quiet architecture of the love that demanded nothing but presence, she began to experience something unfamiliar, safety and unearned, the sacrifice. And Rajiv could not alter her history, but he could retrieve her youth. He could not retrieve her youth, nor reverse institutional cruelty, but he could and did offer her something radical, a life where she did not have to shout or to be believed, no need to make her echo louder. And the echo transformed. Professional care subsided as personal clarity intensified. She addressed the complaint against her with measured transparency, the revised her workload, and the integrated supervision of her routine, not as weakness, more of importantly, her therapeutic practice transformed. She no longer spoke about textbooks, she spoke from embodied understanding. When a patient trembled with shame, she recognized that tremor intimately. Her empathy was no longer conceptual, it was cellular. One afternoon, a young woman in a clinic whispered, I feel like I'm shouting inside, but no one hears. Mira smiled, not with detachment, but with recognition. I can hear you, my dear, she replied, and she meant it. And when the echoes became beneath, and there had been years, entire seasons of her life when Mira felt as though her mind was a chamber of reverberation. Her thoughts did not follow, they ricocheted, and every humiliation, every courtroom sneer, every police station dismissal had not merely wounded her, they have lodged her within her skull like unspent thunder. Sometimes, in the middle of the ordinary day, she would feel an internal shouting, wordless yet deafening, a pressure behind her temples, a tremor in her chest. It wasn't madness, it was accumulation. I used to feel, she told Raju one quiet evening, as if my brain was crowded with my own screams, and they never left, and they just circled, and I had to function as though nothing was happening. And they were seated on the floor of their living room, backs resting against the sofa, the lights dimmed to a tender glow outside. The world persuaded into restless agenda inside. Time had softened. There were moments, she continued, when I would smile as patients advised them of grounding techniques, and inside my own head something was flinching. A part of me was shouting, why did no one protect me? But the shout never crossed my lips. Her voice did not break, it unfolded. I thought of it, acknowledged it, and I would disintegrate. So I compressed it years after years. And Rajiv listened, not with the urgency of a man trying to fix, but with the patience of someone who understands the transformation is not engineered and it is permitted, and now he asked quietly. She turned to him, her expression altered by something almost luminous. Now the echo is changing, she said, and he did not interrupt. When I speak to you, she went on, the noise listens. It is as though the walls inside me have widened, and I did not feel the frantic ricochet and anymore. I feel the space. And widen, I don't feel the space. She hesitated, searching for language precise enough to hold the experience. And you have not tried to dissect me, and you have not tried to possess me. Rajiv breath caught between not of pride but with awe at the vulnerability of her metaphor. A newborn, he repeated quietly. Yes, she smiled faintly, without expectation, without performance, just existing, just breathing, as though I have been placed somewhere warm and safe, and I do not have to anticipate danger. The confession was neither romantic nor dramatic, but it was elemental. And there are moments, she added, her voice lowering, when I sit beside you and feel the kind of comfort I imagine an infant feels in its mother's arms, not desire, not dependency, just warmth, nursing of the soul, a permission to sleep. And the room grew still around them, and Rajiv felt something inside him shift, not the protective fervor of earlier chapters of her story, but not the restrained anger of insinuations, but a profound tenderness, a recognition that love at its most sacred is not conquest but sheltered. He reached for her, his touch deliberate and reverent, and you were forced to grow up quickly, he said. You were trained to guard yourself before you ever knew what safety felt like. If being with me allows you to rest to experience what you have denied, then this is not weakness, that is a healing. And that she inhaled deeply, as though testing the air of their own emotional climate. I used to resent my sensitivity, she admitted. I thought it made me pray, and but now it feels like it's like a gift I can finally hold without fear. And Rajiv smiled softly. Sensitivity is not a frailty, and it is a perception without armor. The words settled into her like a bomb. And later that night, as conversation dissolved into silence, she rested her head gently on his lap, and it was not a gesture of submission, but of trust, an unspoken declaration that vigilance could for once relinquish command. He stroked her hair with the absent-minded gentleness, not performative, not possessive. His movements carried the rhythm of reassurance like a lullaby without lyrics. And the first time in years, Mira allowed her eyes to close without scanning the periphery. And then I feel light, she murmured, off drowsing, as if I had set down something I did not know I was carrying. You have, he whispered, and what if the echoes return? She asked faintly, the old fear flickering. Then we will let them pass through, he replied. They do not own you anymore. They are remnants, not rulers. Her breathing slowed. In that quiet, Rajiv understood something he had not articulated before. He did not need to know every contour of her suffering to love her fully. He did not need to interrogate her past to validate her present. What mattered was her capacity to feel safe enough to rest. And Mira, drifting toward sleep, realized something equally profound. The echo that had once battered her consciousness was no longer a scream trapped in isolation. It had become breath and soft and rhythmic shade. And as she surrendered to sleep, head cradled in his lap, and she experienced a sensation, a kind of foreign yet familiar, the uncomplicated scrutiny of being held without expectation, no courtroom, no PlayStation, no corridors of judgments, and only warm stillness. In that stillness, the echo did not shout. It dissolved into a kind of peace. The comic consequences, their love was neither tempestuous nor naive, it was deliberate. Rajiv did not complete her, he complimented her. The narrative of Savior dissolved into something more profound, partnership. Perhaps he mused once, we are not here to rescue each other, and perhaps we are here to remind each other of our own strength. She considered this carefully. Then you are not my shield. No, he said softly, I am your mirror. In him she saw not dependency but dignity, not escape but explanation. The echo of her childhood shout had not vanished. finished, but it had evolved into a kind of articulation. And the next chapter, it is about the two histories, one horizon. It occurred to Mira not as a guilt but as an awakening. We could see this as part two of the same novel. The echo of my shout will be continued as part two.